Hi, everybody, and welcome to Tea with Jesus for this week. Now, last week we finished Acts 26, and Paul had an interaction with King Agrippa and Bernice, and with the Roman governor Festus. And at the very end of chapter 26, Agrippa told Festus that Paul could have been set free, but of course he had appealed to Caesar. And we know that really it was ultimately Jesus' will that Paul have an opportunity to teach, to share the gospel in Rome itself, which is a major thing. I mean, Rome was like the hub of this powerful Roman Empire. And for Paul to be able to be there and proclaiming the gospel, it's just the love of Jesus showing here, because he wanted the people there, but both any Jews that were there, but also the Romans that were there in Rome, to get a chance to hear about the hope of the gospel. So what we're going to do this week is we're going to go ahead and read chapter 27 of Acts. Now that's going to be verses 1 through 44. And as Paul is on his way to Rome, they encounter some, pretty big adventures. So let's see how the Lord is continuing to be with Paul as he's traveling. And obviously Luke is traveling with him, because he's speaking of, Luke himself is speaking of as we went, so he's there with Paul. All right, starting here now in this rather exciting story, in chapter 27 now of Acts. When the time came, we set sail for Italy. Paul and several other prisoners were placed in the custody of a Roman officer named Julius, a captain of the imperial regiment. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was also with us. We left on a ship whose home port was Adramyttium on the northwest coast of the province of Asia. It was scheduled to make several stops at ports along the coast of the province. The next day, when we docked at Sidon, Julius was very kind to Paul and let him go ashore to visit with friends so they could provide for his needs. Putting out to sea from there, we encountered strong headwinds that made it difficult to keep the ship on course. So we sailed north of Cyprus, between the island and the mainland. Keeping to the open sea, we passed along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, landing at Myra in the province of Lycia. There the commanding officer found an Egyptian ship from Alexandria that was bound for Italy, and he put us on board. We had several days of slow sailing, and after great difficulty we finally neared Cnidus. But the wind was against us, so we sailed across to Crete and along the sheltered coast of the island past the Cape of Salmon. We struggled along the coast with great difficulty and finally arrived at Fair Havens near the town of Lycia. We had lost a lot of time. The weather was becoming dangerous for sea travel because it was so late in the fall, and Paul spoke to the ship's officers about it. Men, he said, I believe there's trouble ahead if we go on. Shipwreck, loss of cargo, and danger to our lives as well. But the officer in charge of the prisoners listened more to the ship's captain and the owner than to Paul. And since Fair Havens was an exposed harbor, a poor place to spend the winter, most of the crew wanted to go on to Phoenix, farther up the coast of Crete, and spend the winter there. Phoenix was a good harbor with only a southwest and northwest exposure. When a light wind began blowing from the south, the sailors thought they could make it. So they pulled up anchor and sailed close to the shore of Crete. But the weather changed abruptly, and a wind of typhoon strength, called a northeaster, burst across the island and blew us out to sea. The sailors couldn't turn the ship into the wind, so they gave up and let it run before the gale. We sailed along the sheltered side of a small island named Cauda, where with great difficulty we hoisted aboard the lifeboat being towed behind us. Then the sailors bound ropes around the hull of the ship to strengthen it. They were afraid of being driven across to the sandbars of Syrtis off the African coast, so they lowered the sea anchor to slow the ship and were driven before the wind. The next day, as gale-force winds continued to batter the ship, the crew began throwing the cargo overboard. The following day, they even took some of the ship's gear and threw it overboard. The terrible storm raged for many days, blotting out the sun and the stars, until at last all hope was gone. No one had eaten for a long time. Finally, Paul called the crew together and said, "Men, you should have listened to me in the first place and not left Crete. You would have avoided all this damage and loss. But take courage. None of you will lose your lives, even though the ship will go down. For last night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me, and he said, 'Don't be afraid, Paul, for you will surely stand trial before Caesar. What's more, God in his goodness has granted safety to everyone sailing with you. So take courage, for I believe God, it will be just as he said, but we will be shipwrecked on an island.'" About midnight on the 14th night of the storm, as we were being driven across the Sea of Adria, the sailors sensed land was near. They dropped a weighted line and found that the water was 120 feet deep. But a little later they measured again and found it was only 90 feet deep. At this rate, they were afraid we would soon be driven against the rocks along the shore. So they threw out 4 anchors from the back of the ship and prayed for daylight. Then the sailors tried to abandon the ship. They lowered the lifeboat as though they were going to put out anchors from the front of the ship. But Paul said to the commanding officer and the soldiers, "You will all die unless the sailors stay aboard." So the soldiers cut the ropes to the lifeboat and let it drift away. Just as day was dawning, Paul urged everyone to eat. "You've been so worried that you haven't touched food for 2 weeks," he said. "Please eat something now for your own good, for not a hair of your heads will perish." Then he took some bread, gave thanks to God before them all, and broke off a piece and ate it. Then everyone was encouraged and began to eat. All 276 of us who were on board. After eating, the crew lightened the ship further by throwing the cargo of wheat overboard. When morning dawned, they didn't recognize the coastline, but they saw a bay with a beach and wondered if they could get to shore by running the ship aground. So they cut off the anchors and left them in the sea. Then they lowered the rudders, raised the foresail, and headed toward shore. But they hit a shoal and ran the ship aground too soon. The bow of the ship stuck fast, while the stern was repeatedly smashed by the force of the waves and began to break apart. The soldiers wanted to kill the prisoners to make sure they didn't swim ashore and escape. But the commanding officer wanted to spare Paul, so he didn't let them carry out their plan. Then he ordered all who could swim to jump overboard first and make for land. The others held on to planks or debris from the broken ship. So everyone escaped safely to shore. Well, that was definitely an adventure, to say the least. I'm going to show you a map here that I have. This is a map showing Paul's 4th journey. And if you look on it here, you can see a lot of these places that we just read about, where they had left Jerusalem, went to Antipatris, and that's where Paul was sent on then to Caesarea, and then to Sidon, and then up between the land and Cyprus to Myra, right there in Lycia, and then Cnidus, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but you can see there, that was the next place. And then they sailed down and they went south of Crete, and they didn't want to stay in Fair Havens. So they end up all over the place out here in this terrible storm. And then they ended up in Malta. And that is where they have come ashore now, on the island of Malta. As God is sending Paul on to Rome to come before Caesar, Along this whole trip, you can see the Lord protecting Paul and, you know, taking good care to make sure he's going to get there okay, and graciously protecting everybody that's on this Egyptian ship as they came into that terrible storm. It looks like Luke, here, the author of Acts, has a wonderful grasp of seamanship. He's very detailed about what happened and what all they had to do. He seems to really understand it. If we look back here in verse 1, chapter 27, we can see that Paul and other prisoners, including Luke, were put into the custody of a Roman officer. His name was Julius, and he was a captain of the imperial regiment. And this was one of 5 Roman regiments that were stationed near the seaport city of Caesarea, where Paul is leaving from. And so there's 5 of them there, and he was a captain in one of the Roman imperial regiments. This Julius was the one that was put in charge. You know, they were trying to avoid really severe, strong southerly winds. So remember, we looked on the map that they sailed to the north of the island of Cyprus as they're going along there to try to get into the best weather that they can. The city of Myra that was mentioned is actually now in an area, of Asia Minor that we now know of as Turkey, and that's where that city was at. Now, this Egyptian ship that they eventually transferred over to was from Alexandria, and it was probably a grain ship. Let's go ahead and look at verse 38. After eating, the crew lightened the ship further by throwing a cargo of wheat overboard. And so obviously there was a cargo there of grains. And the Alexandria, where the ship was from, was the Roman capital in Egypt. Egypt was the principal source of grain for Rome, and this grain fleet was very important. It was like the lifeblood of the empire, because that's where they get a lot of their food. A lot of their grain would come from Egypt. So very likely this ship from Alexandria would have had obviously had a load of wheat, because they dumped it later. And so this was a ship, the ship that they transferred over to as they're going along on this adventure. So they were already having real problems with the weather and the wind, even at this point. And they finally arrived at a very interesting place, a port called Fair Havens, near the town of Lycia. And that is, on the southern part of Crete. Now they are into the Mediterranean, like underneath the land, south of it, rather than in between, like Cyprus and the land. Now they're south of Crete. And they felt like that was a very exposed port. They didn't really want to stay there. And one of the things that we have to understand is that they knew very well they were coming into a time of the year where it was way too dangerous to be sailing. The weather was going to start, and the winter was going to start being, really, really not workable to be able to sail. And this dangerous period for sailing would begin about mid-September and then lasted until early November. That was when it was starting to get really dangerous. And then after that, early November, all navigation on the open sea halted until winter was over. Everybody just got into a port somewhere and didn't try to do any more sailing over the winter. It was just way too treacherous. So if we look here, this was getting to be more and more a dangerous time of year to try to be sailing. And, Paul talked to the ship's officers. He really spoke to them about it while they were still in Fairhaven. And, it was getting later into the fall, and Paul told them, if we look in verse 10, Paul said, "Men, I believe there's trouble ahead if we go on. Shipwreck, loss of cargo, and danger to our lives as well." But, the officer that was in charge of the prisoners, he was much more willing to listen to the ship's captain and to the ship's owner than he would be to listen to the prisoner, Paul. And they didn't like the fact that Fairhaven was an exposed harbor. It was not a good place to be stuck for the winter. So they wanted to get to a place called Phoenix, which was farther up the coast of Crete. on the island there, and they wanted to winter there. It was a good harbor, and the only exposure was like southwest and northwest, so it was much more sheltered for them. But then, when they decided to go ahead and get going, the wind seemed pretty good at first, but then all of a sudden it got really, really strong. And they're going close to the shores of Crete on the island there. I'm going to show you the map again. You can see that they've gone from Fair Havens, and they're kind of, going along the shore of Crete there, trying to get to Phoenix. Then the weather just changed really abruptly, and a wind of typhoon strength, called a northeaster, burst across the island. And I hear about nor'easters a lot. My sister lives up where they're very vulnerable to nor'easters. And a typhoon is just another term. It's like a Pacific term that we would use for hurricane. In other words, these are very, very, very high winds, typhoon level winds. And, they called it a nor'easter. It was a northeaster. And what it did at that point when it hit, it just blew them out to sea. They were trying to stay really close to Crete, and this wind came along and just blew them out into the water. And you can see here they suddenly got just shoved out into a nice big open part of the Mediterranean Sea here in this ship. I want to take a look before we go on and look at a verse, in verse 10 of chapter 27 here. And it says, "Men, I believe there's trouble ahead if we go on. Shipwreck, loss of cargo, and danger to our lives as well." It's a very interesting word that is used there that is translated trouble. Hubris. It's called hubris. Hurt, loss, injury arising from violence, damage caused by the elements, hardship, detrimental things, trouble, danger. And in 2 Corinthians 12:10, let's take a look at that just for a second. It says here in verse 10, "That's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses and in the insults, hardships, persecutions, and troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Because then, of course, Jesus is strong in his life. So in that scripture where Paul is describing the reproaches that he endured for the Lord's sake, for Jesus' sake, this word hubris denotes insolence, impudence. People give him a haughty attitude, insults, injury, persecution, affronting. It's definitely adversarial. And he used that in terms of what they were going to run into with the ship, and in terms of a lot of things that were brought into his life because he was really speaking out for Jesus. I thought that was interesting word there, hubris. So at this point, once they got blown out to sea, they couldn't turn the ship into the wind and keep it under control. They had to give it up and just let it be blown, run before the gale, and just be blown along by the gale. And they ended up, you can't really see it on the map, but they ended up along the sheltered side of a small island named Cauda, C-A-U-D-A. And then they were hoisting the lifeboat, aboard that had been towed behind them. It was a smaller rowboat, a dinghy. It was used all the time to transport people from the big ship to the land and back again. So it was just, it's like we have people that we watch that live on sailboats, and the dinghy is just their car. It's how they get around from the boat to wherever they need to go on land. So they're bringing this back up to the ship now. And then the sailors are wrapping rope around the hull, hoping they can keep it from, being all broken up in this storm. Ropes were used to strengthen the ship's hull. They would wrap around, hoping to try to keep it from breaking apart in all of this storm. And then they were afraid they were going to get blown driven across to the sandbars of Syrtis, which would be off the North African coast. Now, this is an area of quicksand off the coast of northern Africa. They certainly did not want to get caught in that. So this, if we look on a map, it's not that far to the northern coast of Africa in that part of the Mediterranean Sea. This was a dire situation, absolutely. It was not unusual if there was a really bad storm for a crew to start just dumping everything they can, just everything they can dump overboard besides people, just to try to make the craft float more, be more buoyant, and maybe survive better. And so they started throwing the cargo overboard, and they got rid of everything they could. Obviously not the wheat yet, and they certainly didn't throw any people overboard, but they're trying to lessen the burden on the ship as it's blown in this big storm. Then, they even started getting rid of some of the ship's gear. So it says in verse 20, the terrible storm raged for many days, blotting out the sun and the stars, until at last all hope was gone. And I'm just trying to imagine what it must have been like to be caught in a storm. You're being thrown around constantly. You can't see the stars. The sun's all hidden by the storm. The other day I was coming home and driving our big old F-250 pickup. I call it Samson, big old, beautiful, big old pickup. And driving that, and we had a storm hit here, but it's the kind of thing where like when you see hurricanes being pictured, the rain was so driven so hard by high winds, it was all sideways. I mean, you couldn't see anything except for driving water and occasionally something being blown over or trees being, bent over. In fact, we went into the gym later on and did a workout that day, and the guy at the gym, the coach there, said that someone had been trying to get out of their car and get into the gym as quick as they could, and the rain was blowing so hard that half of him was soaking wet and the other half was dry, so as he tried to get into the building. So I wasn't about to try to drive in it. The visibility would have been very poor, so I just stayed safe, and when everything calmed down, then I drove home. Grateful that I could reassure Bill by text that I was fine. But I can just imagine being in this incredible storm. It's been going on now day after day after day, and to the point where Luke literally says here that at last all hope was gone. They just don't know what else to be able to do. Now, Paul has been just staying connected to Jesus, staying connected to the Lord, and he starts to just feel real compassion, the Lord's compassion, and just caring about how the crew's doing. So we look in verse 21. It says, no one had eaten for a long time. Finally, Paul called the crew together and said, men, you should have listened to me in the first place and not left Crete. Just indicating that God knew what he was talking about. He would have avoided this damage and loss. But then he tries to really encourage them. And this wasn't an I told you so. This was God revealed this to me, and we need to listen to God. He knows what he's talking about. And then he tells them in verse 22, but take courage. None of you will lose your lives, even though the ship will go down. And then I'm going to go ahead and read through verse 26. This will be 23 through 26. For last night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me. And he said, don't be afraid, Paul, for you will surely stand trial before Caesar. That was the Lord's will for him. What's more, God in his goodness has granted safety to everyone sailing with you. So take courage, for I believe God. It will be just as he said, but we will be shipwrecked on an island. And he's trying to show them that God had known what he was talking about before, and they need to trust that God knows what he's talking about now. And take courage that they are going to actually all survive, even though there will be great loss and they will lose the ship. So now, after he had talked to them about midnight on the 14th night of the storm, oh my goodness, this has been blowing them all over the place for 2 weeks. I mean, I don't know if I'd be able to eat because I'd be so seasick, but these are sailors. It's got to have been really rough. And they're being driven across an area called the Sea of Adria, and they begin to sense that land was near. So they dropped a weighted line, and they found out the water was 120 feet deep. And then they measured again, and now it was only 90 feet deep. That would be like 20 fathoms and 15 fathoms. It was 37 meters and 27 meters, if you're more familiar with that. Yes, and they knew they were getting into more shallow water, and they're afraid they were going to get driven into the rocks along the shore of land. So they went ahead and threw out 4 anchors from the back of the ship, and they're just trying to keep sea anchors in. They'd been using a sea anchor earlier, and now they're putting 4 anchors out on the back, hoping to stabilize the ship a little bit so it doesn't just get driven into the rocks. And they're just praying for daylight. So yeah, this has been like midnight. They're realizing the depth of the water is getting less. And these sailors, you know, they're very experienced, and they can tell, they're feeling and how things sound. They can tell land is getting near. They can just feel it. And so as this is happening, and they're afraid they're going to get dashed into the, you know, into the rocks, the actual sailors, yeah, let's take a second. We have the sailors, we have the captain of the ship and the owner, we have prisoners, and we have Roman soldiers there, and a Roman commander. And so we got these different groups that have been on this ship together. Now, the sailors were trying to abandon the ship. They lowered the lifeboat like they were going to put out anchors from the front of the ship. They're actually trying to get into the lifeboat and get out of the big ship. And they're just trying not to let anybody know that's what they're doing, but they just are trying to get out. And so Paul said to the commanding officer and the soldiers, and these are the Roman soldiers, "You're all going to die unless these sailors stay on board." And he just knew that God was going to protect them, but they needed to stay on board. They would not have survived if they had taken off in the smaller boat, you know, to try to get away from the ship. And so I can imagine what this scene must have been like. It's verse 32, so the soldiers cut the ropes to the lifeboat and just let it drift away. That was probably kind of a tense time. The sailors had been desperate to try to get away from the ship and maybe not be, you know, crunched on the rocks in this big ship. They were trying to get away, and then the soldiers come and just cut the lifeboat, and the lifeboat drifts away. If we look now, I'm going to go back to verses 10, 11, and 12. This is where Paul had told them, you know, we shouldn't be leaving here. This is going to cause, there's going to be a shipwreck. There's going to be loss of cargo. Our lives will be in danger. And I really think that by this point, especially the military, were really believing that Paul knew what he was talking about. And so, you know, as I said before, the Roman commanding officer and his soldiers now went ahead and absolutely assumed command of this Egyptian ship. It was a non-military vessel, but they went ahead and assumed command of this vessel at this point. So now the day is dawning. The sun's starting to come up. They had quite an eventful night. Just the lifeboat being cut free, and knowing they're getting to shallower, and trying to put in the sea anchors, and wondering if they're going to crash, and they can't see until the sun comes back up. And as the day was dawning, Paul was urging everyone to eat. Now, I think that God was really leading Paul here, because they probably needed that strength. God knew what was going to happen, and he's leading Paul. They needed to eat. They needed that strength. And he says, you know, you've been so worried you haven't touched food for 2 weeks. They probably had eaten hardly anything. And he said, you know, verse 34, please eat something now for your own good, for not a hair of your heads will perish. He's so sure and confident in what God has told him. And then he took some bread, gave thanks to God before all of them, and broke off a piece and ate it. And then I love how detailed Luke is here. And then everyone was encouraged in verse 36 and began to eat. All 276 of us who were on board. And every single one of those 276 lives was truly under God's protection. And that's why Paul told him, you can't be leaving, people can't leave in that lifeboat. You've got to stay together. God is going to protect us. And then after they all ate, the crew continued to lighten the ship, and they threw this very valuable, important cargo of wheat overboard. And of course, the ship's going to wreck anyway, but they're trying to keep it going as much as they possibly can. So now they're approaching this small island. It's called Malta. You can look on the map. It's just south of Sicily, and of course Italy, you know, is just north of there. And that is where they're going to end up, you know, crashing, is in Malta. And so the morning really dawned, and they didn't recognize the coastline But they did see a bay with a beach and wondered if they could get to shore by running the ship aground. Can we just get in there and crunch it into maybe some sand or something on the beach? So they cut off the anchors and that they had put out there and just left them in the sea. I'm trying to imagine what this whole scene must have really been like, because this really happened. And they're just desperately trying to make it. And so they cut the anchors, they lowered the rudders, which is going to help stabilize them in the water better, and raised the foresail, the sail in the front, the foresail, and headed toward shore, hoping they could kind of crunch into the sand. But they hit a shoal and ran the ship aground too soon. And so I'm trying to picture this. Luke is being very specific and giving us a vivid picture here of what's going on. The bow of the ship in the front stuck fast into this shoal, ran aground and stuck fast. It's a shoal, like it's a shallow area that they weren't anticipating yet. And but the back of the ship, the stern, kept getting smashed by the force of the waves. So the front is like wedged in where it got so shallow, and then the back of the ship still getting beaten to death by these storm winds. And so the ship is literally starting to break apart now. It's taken all it can take, and it's starting to get, one part's fastened in, the other's getting beaten, and it's just breaking the ship apart. Now at this point then, as if we need anything to make this more dramatic, the soldiers are saying they want to kill the prisoners. They just feel like it's important. They want to go ahead and kill the prisoners because they don't want any prisoners to swim ashore and then escape. They're responsible for these prisoners. But the commanding officer, who I think had been really kind of watching Paul and I think seeing how God, I don't know, he did not want anything to happen to Paul. I think he'd been watching him, and I think he'd been really affected by being around Paul and the peace that he had and the wisdom he was showing. And so it says here the commanding officer wanted to spare Paul. So he would not let them kill the prisoners. He wouldn't let them carry out their plan. And of course, he's in charge of the ship at this point. So at the very end here, I'm going to read verses 43 and 44. But the commanding officer wanted to spare Paul, so he didn't let them carry out their plan. Then he ordered all who could swim to jump overboard first and make for land. So obviously there was some on there that couldn't swim. Boy, that'd be scary. Oh, I'm a strong swimmer, and I just can't even imagine being on something that could sink any minute and I can't swim. Oh my goodness. So the others, who obviously couldn't swim, held on to planks or debris from the broken ship. And then we have this very important statement at the very end of chapter 27. God kept his promise, so everyone escaped safely to shore. So all 276 of these people are able to get out of this ship as it's being torn apart, and are able to, with the storm going on, and God brought them safely into the shore, and no one died. In fact, they even had some food in their belly to give them some strength as they're dealing with all this. And so, Paul knew that God would be faithful to his word. So this was quite a major ordeal for him to be able to go from when they set sail in the ship at Caesarea, in the Caesarea area, and then ended up in Malta. So it was a big, huge storm they had to deal with. All right, let's pray. Lord, I really thank you for how you've really just given us so much really good information about how you worked as your church was really beginning to develop after you ascended into heaven, Jesus. I'm so thankful we have these accounts that have been preserved so carefully for us. I know you've protected the integrity of these incredible books that we have in our Bible, and I'm thankful that thousands of years later it's available here for us. Wow, that's such a gift. Well, Lord, for those that are sick, those that are struggling, for those that feel separated, please bring your healing, your encouragement, your strength. Help people to find unexpected joys and to find ways to support each other, and to know that we can just trust you and Lord, I just pray that people will not feel isolated, but they can feel connected. For those that are truly lonely, Lord, just show them your presence. Show them how real you are, and show people ways to be able to be your arms and your voice and your love shown in their life. Lord, help us to be forgiving people. Bring reconciliation. Help us to know that every human being, whether it's this 276, let me get that right, Lord. Yes, whether it's the 276 that were on this ship or the untold millions, the billions that we have on the planet today, every life is so precious to you, Lord. And help us to see it the same way, that people are not our enemy. Help us to love them the way you do, and to want your salvation for them and your hope and your eternity. So, Lord, we just trust everything in your hands in Jesus' name. Amen. If you would like to join us for our church service, which is online, 10 o'clock Eastern Standard Time on Sunday mornings, there will be a little orange circle in the end screen. It's got little arrows on it. You can tap out, touch that, click on it, and it'll take you to where you can find our church service, which will, it's shown live at 10 o'clock. Or I'll give you a link in the description below. And then there's interaction that goes on during that time, but also those services will then continue to be on YouTube. So if you wanted to join us, we wanted to welcome you and invite you. So, all right, guys. Well, we are going to be wrapping up Acts pretty soon. This has been quite a deal. And I know God is going to fulfill everything that he said. So I will see you soon. I love you guys, and be blessed. And we'll see you next week. Okay, bye-bye.